Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now. But can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 152. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to the rolling hills, the mangrove swamps, and the small towns of Georgia.
Cathedral, got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. Before we get into the interview today, I do have two news stories for you. The first one is the strangest thing. As if United Airlines hadn't been having enough troubles with their finances, last week they had an echo of the past happen in a weird internet thing. What happened was apparently a 6-year-old news story that said that United Airlines was planning on going bankrupt showed up through a strange collection of events on Google and got reported by Bloomberg, causing a 75% drop in the stock of United Airlines on a single day. All of this because an internet search engine didn't know that that was an old story. It's just not a good year for the airlines. Although Continental seems to be having a better year. They're saying that all those new luggage fees we love so much, charging $15 per checked bag, are going to raise them $100 million in revenue. For links to both those stories and other news items, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Kim Hatcher, who's the Public Affairs Coordinator for Georgia's State Park Systems. Kim, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
First of all, we should clarify we're talking about Georgia, the state in the United States, not Georgia, the country that's been in the news. And a number of people had requested more information about Georgia, and it's been a hard time trying to line up an expert. And Kim, I'm so glad to have you on the show to tell us about, now, you're living in Georgia. Is it your home state or an adopted state for you?
No, I'm one of the few who's a native.
Okay.
I'm from here. I've lived my whole life in the Atlanta area.
Interesting. Okay. So why should someone come to Georgia for vacation? What is there to see in Georgia?
You know, the nice thing about Georgia is you can drive the whole state from top to bottom in maybe 7 hours, but we have such an amazing variety of terrain. The environment is so diverse here. We've got everything from the mountains to the coast and salt marsh and barrier islands. We've got the Okefenokee Swamp. We have beautiful grassy plains in middle and south Georgia. And, of course, we've got Atlanta, which is a great bustling city.
And if I had a week to spend in Georgia, what would you personally recommend? What's a great itinerary?
Well, I would start in the North Georgia mountains. A lot of people don't know that the Appalachian Mountain Range actually ends in Georgia. We've got the foothills here, and we call it the Blue Ridge Mountains. And you could spend a whole week just in the mountains. Georgia is a hiker's and a mountain biker's paradise. We have wonderful waterfalls and canyons. Camping would be a great thing to do, or renting cottages is pretty popular in the North Georgia mountains. I would spend a little bit of time in Atlanta because, of course, we've got a wonderful aquarium, we've got a wonderful zoo, and great restaurants and shopping and nightlife and lots of things to do in Atlanta. But I think what a lot of people bypass is middle and south Georgia.
Okay.
And even growing up here, I did the same thing. My family always went to the mountains or we went to the coast for vacation, and we skipped everything in the middle. And when I started working for the state park system, I had to travel all over. And I was absolutely blown away by what people can do and see in middle and south Georgia. So I would also make a point to explore some of the backcountry roads. Definitely get off the interstate, because all you're going to see on the interstate are pine trees, but that's really not what is beyond the interstate. Take your time exploring the natural areas and then end up down on coastal Georgia, which is where the town of Savannah is. If people aren't familiar with that, it's sort of like Charleston, but a little scruffier. That's the way I would describe Savannah.
I'm assuming that's not coming from their Chamber of Commerce. That's not their new motto.
Well, I mean that lovingly. I go to Savannah every year. I think it's fun. Charleston is very genteel.
Okay.
Savannah, of course, has its genteel too, but it also has a great, just more casual atmosphere, barefoot atmosphere, I guess you could say.
Okay.
I would explore the barrier islands on Georgia. Jekyll Island is one of my favorites. Our islands have a lot of salt marsh and a lot of intracoastal waterway, a lot of outfitters there where you could take canoe trips, guided boat trips, and fishing. Georgia's coast is beautiful. I think a lot of people don't know that we do have a coast. And also one place I think everyone should see at some point in their life, and I'm always disappointed at how often I meet people who live in Georgia, even those who are natives here, who've never seen the Okefenokee Swamp, which is one of the biggest and most grand wetlands in the United States. It's one of the most fascinating, beautiful, serene, quiet places I've ever been.
And we're in southeast Georgia then by the time we're at the Okefenokee, as I recall.
Correct, yeah. And the Okefenokee flows into northern Florida.
Okay. You mentioned getting off...
That's a lot.
Yeah, no, that's great. You mentioned getting off the interstate and exploring some of the back roads. Any particular, small towns in that middle part that you've had a great, surprising experience?
Yeah, there are. There's a town called Cordele, which is in southern Georgia. There's a tourist attraction there called the Sam Shortline Excursion Train. And you board in Cordele, and it takes you to Americus, which is a nice town with some beautiful, typical southern big homes and really old, beautiful hotels. And then the train goes out to the boyhood farm of former President Jimmy Carter. And it's a really pretty place to visit. His house is still there, and it's furnished, and you can push a little button and listen to recordings of him talking about what it was like to grow up in rural Georgia. But it's also pretty. It has a little windmill and a corn growing and a good look at what southern rural life was like. The train also stops in a tiny little town called Leslie that most people have never heard of, and it has a telephone museum, which when I first heard the train was going to be stopping at this museum on a regular basis, I thought, oh, that's kind of odd. It just didn't intrigue me at first, but it was the most fun thing that I went to on the train ride. I was absolutely fascinated. You won't believe how big this museum is and how much cool stuff they have, and switchboards, old cars, old clothes, and, of course, telephones. So the Sam Shortline Excursion Train is kind of a neat thing to do in South Georgia.
Okay.
There's also one of my favorite state parks I go to every year is called Reed Bingham State Park, and it's in Adel. One of the reasons I like it is it's right off the major interstate I-75, so it's pretty close. It's easy to stop to, especially if you're going through Georgia where everybody's going to see Mickey Mouse. Going to Florida,
Sure.
It's a nice place to stop for a little bit and take a break. But what I like about Reed Bingham State Park is they have a lake that's filled with lily pads and cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. You can rent a canoe and paddle up this small lake, and last 2 times I've done that, I've seen baby alligators and, of course, plenty of big alligators. They have eagles nesting. This park is known for their gopher tortoise rescue project. With armadillos are not actually native to Georgia, and they're migrating up through, and so they're eating a lot of gopher tortoise eggs.
Huh.
And so that's really decimating the numbers of these turtles. And so this park's, their rangers dig up the eggs, incubate them, let them grow a little bit, and then release them back out. And they make it a public program where kids can come and help release the turtles or help gather the eggs, and they're really cute. So it's a fun park, too. They have a lot of good wildlife programs there.
Now, your official title, and we didn't use the whole thing, includes that you work for the historic parks in Georgia also. Now, I'm a huge history buff, so we talked about the Jimmy Carter National Park, or National Historic Site, I suppose it would be, that his birthplace, not just the house, but also the school he went to high school in and such. But what are some of your favorite things, maybe that people know about or maybe that they don't know about?
We have a lot of Native American history here.
Okay.
Of course, the Trail of Tears began
Tears.
in Georgia.
Uh-huh.
The actual government action that started that was signed in northern Georgia. So we have the former Cherokee capital. It's called New Echota Historic Site, and it's north of Atlanta. I'd say maybe an hour north of Atlanta. Easy to get to. Some of the buildings are restored. You can walk through and see that they had a Supreme Court house much like we did, and there's a tavern, and there's a school, and there's a print shop. Nearby is Chief Van House Historic Site. He was one of the wealthiest Cherokee chiefs of their nation. But we also have older Indian sites. We have a number of Indian mounds in Georgia. So pretty close to those 2 Cherokee sites are Etowah Indian mounds. I love Etowah because it's such a pretty, quiet place. You can climb to the top of a 63-foot Indian mound and look out over the plaza and imagine what life was like. This was during about 1000 AD to 1550 AD. They had a village area. You can see the pits that were dug, the defensive ditch, and it's also on the Etowah River, so it's really pretty. And there's good birding there. There's a really nice museum there. We have Indian mounds in northern Georgia and southern Georgia. So another place you could visit all the way towards the south is called Kolomoki Mounds. It kind of combines state park attractions like camping and hiking and fishing, and there's a lake. But also they have a wonderful museum and wonderful Indian mounds down there as well.
Interesting.
Georgia has a rich history. I mean, we've got, of course, the colonial history on the coast. We have the ruins of a colonial estate just outside Savannah. Sherman's March to the Sea ended at Fort McAllister, which is south of Savannah, and that is now a wonderful state park where people can go and stay and see the cannons and the earthworks.
Okay. And for those of you who are not familiar, I think you're doing a bit of Googling here for what we're talking about with the Trail of Tears and Sherman's March to the Sea, but I think at least a lot of Americans are familiar with those. What do the guidebooks recommend, and we talked about this ahead of time, that you personally think might be a waste of time?
Well,
without trying to step on anybody's toes here.
Right. What they want to do on a Saturday is going to be different. Guidebooks often recommend Stone Mountain Park. It's very close to Atlanta. It's an enormous granite mountain that has been carved with historical figures and faces, somewhat like Mount Rushmore. It's very crowded. It's popular with kids. It's more of an active park. And so if you're looking to get away and looking for quiet or hiking or camping, I would suggest heading out a little bit further and go into some of the state parks that we have. The town of Helen in North Georgia is a fantastic, fun place, and it always makes the guidebooks because it has this shtick of being an alpine town, and kind of have to see it to understand it. All of the buildings look very alpine. A lot of the restaurants are German. And so it's a fantastic place for people who enjoy going into the fudge shops.
Okay.
It's popular for Oktoberfest. A lot of people go drink beer and have fun there. But if you're looking for more of a true mountain experience, I might hit some of the towns around that. Or there's actually a state park near there called Unicoi State Park that's nice and quiet and beautiful.
Do you have a personal favorite alternative to that?
To
another mountain, yeah.
That's a tough one. There's a park called Black Rock Mountain, which is in the extreme northeast corner of Georgia. The nearest town is Clayton, and it's the highest state park in Georgia. I guess the highest point is just under 4,000 feet. It's a beautiful place for hiking and overlooks and scenery, and they have a small waterfall. And you can rent cabins, you can go camping. It's also a lot cooler in the summer there because of the elevation.
Okay. Any other places? We talked about some other ones that the tourists missed. Any other one place that you really wish people knew about? The guidebooks just really kind of overlook it.
You know, I could fill a whole hour.
I know you could.
Truly, it's tough. There's a place west of Atlanta called Sweetwater Creek State Park. It's fairly popular. It's very popular for people in that area. Everybody hikes to the ruins of a textile mill that had been burned during the Civil War, and it's along a beautiful, wide, large creek. But what a lot of people don't do is continue on the trails past that mill. You can get quite a workout, and there's a number of trails at that park, and it's so close to Atlanta. It's really close to Six Flags theme park. You feel like you're a million miles away. One of the other places that I would suggest is called George L. Smith State Park, and it is in middle east Georgia, and kind of in the middle of nowhere, and I mean that in a good way. The campsites are right on this lake with beautiful cypress trees and Spanish moss, and it's so quiet. They have a covered bridge that is the dam for the lake and also has a mill inside, so you can go in and see some of the historic items that are in there. Nearby is a town called Canoochee, and one of my favorite things about working for the state park system is the food in the rural areas. And so when
that was my next question. Okay.
Good segue. Whenever I plan a trip to George L. Smith State Park, I make a point to go have all-you-can-eat fried catfish at Canoochee Catfish.
Any other culinary delights that would await us in Georgia?
Oh, yeah.
Other places?
Well, if you spend the night at the lodge at Smithgall Woods, which is near the town of Helen that I mentioned earlier, dinner comes with your meal. Everything's included there, and they have a resident chef who often will cook trout, which North Georgia mountains are known for trout. So the food is excellent at Smithgall Woods. When I'm staying at Black Rock Mountain State Park that I mentioned earlier, it's near the town of Clayton, and in Clayton is a little place called Clayton Cafe, which is not to be confused with Clayton Inn, which I think they have a restaurant too. I just haven't been there. But Clayton Cafe has some of the best fried chicken in Georgia. It's not open on Sunday, so you have to plan around that. I think actually it's only open for lunch. And, of course, there's the stereotype for southern Georgia food, and we do have excellent fried chicken and fried catfish, and that's one of the nice things about being in the rural areas. And for people who aren't from the South, if someone tells you go to a meat and three, have you ever heard the term?
I have not heard of meat and three.
It's called meat. You don't say meat and three. You say meat and three.
Meat and three. Oh, sorry.
And that means from a buffet, you pick one meat and three vegetables.
Oh, okay.
When you're traveling around, go to a local and ask them, where's the local meat and three? And I mean, I'm sure it's just like any other town. If you look in the tourist books and there's a restaurant advertised over and over with a big full-page glossy ad, that's probably not the one you want to go to. At least for me, I would prefer to go to the little local places that probably can't afford those ads.
As we start to wind this down, the best day you've ever had in Georgia, maybe a real quintessential Georgia day for you.
Gosh, with the variety here, if I could, I would spend a lot more days down in the Okefenokee Swamp. I would stay at Stephen Foster State Park, which is the western entrance to the swamp, in a kayak. That's what I would prefer to do, is to spend the day slipping across the black mirrored water in a kayak, looking at the birds, looking at the wildlife and the alligators and listening to the frogs. And it's just beautiful.
I normally, when we're talking about faraway places like the Madagascar show that you just recently listened to, we talk about language and whether that's going to be a barrier. I don't normally ask that when we're talking about the United States, but for those of us from the North, is there going to be anything that is going to be a barrier in the Southern dialect?
I don't think so. Y'all is a proper contraction. It is you all.
Yes.
Yonder is a correct word. There's, of course, the stereotype of the South, and we're all quite aware of that. But Atlanta has become such an international city.
Sure.
It really has, that it's spilling over. People are starting to travel more. We have a lot of communities in Georgia where Spanish is frequently spoken. So I don't think it's going to be a barrier at all, that stereotype that they're going to look at you and say, you ain't from around here, are you, boy? You're not really going to experience that.
The one conversation I can think of that I don't think would happen outside the South is one that a friend of mine had in Atlanta, where she's behind somebody in line and they say, "Do you want a Coke?" "Yes." "What kind?" "Orange."
That's true. I grew up always saying Coke, and they'd say, "What kind?" And it could be a Fanta, it could be Sprite. Everything here it's a Coke.
Despite the fact that Coke is from Atlanta, and you can go to Coke World or whatever it is in Atlanta,
True.
that is the generic in Georgia. So
In a lot of places, yeah.
yeah.
That's changing, though, because when we first started talking, I said I'm one of the few natives, and it's true. It's kind of hard to find somebody from Atlanta here
Interesting.
now.
Best resources for planning a trip to Georgia?
The internet is a wonderful resource, of course, for planning. We have a great website called georgiastateparks.org.
Mm-hmm.
And what I like about our website is you can click on the part of the state that you're traveling on, just track your path, and there'll be links to each state park and historic site with photographs and maps and telling you all about them. And I'm a big camper. Well, that's how I've gotten to see the United States. I mean, have tent, will travel. It doesn't matter how much money you have or don't have. If you're camping, you can see places. And that's the same for Georgia. You can always find a campsite.
Okay. One warning you would give about going to Georgia? When to come, when not to come?
Georgia summers are pretty hot, of course. You know, July and August is not the time to be exploring southern Georgia. We have what's called the Gnat Line, and
the Gnat Line.
The Gnat Line, yeah. It's an invisible line in Georgia, and that's where the gnats start. And so during the summer, people just learn to kind of blow them away from their faces, but it's not really an issue in the Atlanta area or northern Georgia. Middle summer can be really hot. Winter is nice, of course. I mean, we do have some snowy days, and it is cold, but it's not so cold that you can't get by on the roads. Public transportation, you definitely need a car. Even in Atlanta, you need a car, unfortunately. The city just was not built around a transportation system.
Mm-hmm. As we go to wrap this up, if you had to summarize Georgia, the Georgia that you know and love, in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Green.
Okay.
Green. Variety. And easy. I mean, I think it's an easy place to visit. It's easy to get information. People will talk to you. They'll tell you, where to go, where to stay, where to eat. Green, because a lot of people who are from the West tell me how much they notice. Well, we have trees. I guess one of the, can I have 4 words? Trees. Because even in the city, we have a whole lot of trees in Georgia. Mm-hmm. And not just pine trees. I mean, there's wonderful hardwoods, too.
Okay. Well, Kim, thank you very much for coming on the show and telling us about your home state.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
And I hope people are encouraged by this, not just to go to Georgia, but also to check out their local state park system, which I think also may have some of these undiscovered gems. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
That would normally be the end of the interview here, but we kept the recorder running and actually learned a little more about Atlanta, so I'm going to play that piece as well. People
say Atlanta's a great place to live but not visit.
Oh, interesting.
You hear that a lot here. It's hard to get around as a tourist, and if you're using the tourist guides in the city, you can see where you might think that. And if you stay on the interstates, it's not very attractive. But if you get off the interstates, it is.
I've only been to Atlanta outside the airport once, and it was on business, and it was this year right after that tornado touchdown.
Oh, wow.
And so I didn't get into downtown. I was hoping to get into downtown Atlanta, but they were recommending I not do that.
Yeah, and downtown is dead. It really is. It's the little pocket neighborhoods around downtown where people go. Midtown is the hot happening place for the beautiful people.
Okay.
But if you're into art galleries and hanging out on cafe patios and things like that, you have to find the little neighborhoods in the outskirts.
Do you have a favorite little neighborhood in the outskirts?
I like Virginia Highlands, and I like Decatur.
Okay.
Those are my places.
Next time I'm there, I'll have to check those out.
Yeah.
In the Internet Resources portion of the show today, I do have an article on another domestic U.S. destination, and that's Las Vegas. And it's an article from rewardprograms.org, and it's the ultimate guide to getting comped in Vegas. So if you're planning on doing a trip to Vegas and you want to get stuff for free, this is a good thing for you to read, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. There was a big change for me in doing the Amateur Traveler this week. Many of you know that I've had a contract with Podshow, now Mevio, for the last 2 years to sell advertising on this show. You may have also noticed there haven't been that many ads actually sold in this show. I had asked out of the contract, asked that they not renew it for a third year, whether for that reason or because their business model is changing, probably more the latter. They have granted that desire, and they have not renewed my contract, so I'm now back on my own as an independent podcaster, at least for now, as I look at other options. So if you're interested in advertising in the show, let me know, but that's going to potentially make some changes for the show in the long term as I try and find ways to make this work potentially as a side business, or who knows, maybe someday as a primary business. But I did want to tell you that news. If you listen to the show right after it comes out, I'm probably on the East Coast on business. When those sort of things happen, I'm trying to see if we could maybe arrange for a get-together with people who are out there. I tend to do that in one of two ways, and if you're listening to these shows late, you wouldn't know that unless you were either following me on Twitter, so you go to twitter.com/Chris2X and follow me if that's a program that you're using, or you can check out those sort of things I put in announcements in the discussion board. amateurtraveler.com/board, usually in the announcements section. So if you're hearing this in time and you're in the East Coast, either in New York City or Boston, let me know, and maybe we can plan something where we could get some of us together in the greater Amateur Traveler community. Speaking of the community, I had a letter this week from Larry. Larry wrote two things. One, he said Siberia episode was really interesting. Any of us who've done a package bus tour, even one not as extreme as the guests, have our own horror stories. And then he also asked a good question. Where do you find these guests and topics? I think I'm going to listen for a few minutes, and I end up listening for the entire podcast. Well, that's a great thing to hear you say. Where I find guests, some of the guests, as you may have heard me mention as we introduce some of the guests, have listened to the show before because they are you. They are coming from the community, and there are people who have suggested to me, hey, you haven't done a show yet on, and then pitch basically an idea to me. And that's the best way to pitch an idea, is tell me that you've got a destination you have been to, especially one that you're very knowledgeable about. I've tried to really up the ante for the guests recently because I am getting a lot more guests that are pitching me ideas. So we're trying to see if we can make sure that every show is a winner. And then the other place, I am a member of a travel writers group on Google that has provided a number of very good guests for me. Some people are people that I have run into, that if they've mentioned their travels and when they've interested me enough, I've invited them on the show. And then I did recently put out a request to help a reporter out, which is a mailing list for getting sources, and I was just inundated with guests. And so we'll be getting a number of people, including the guest we had on this show, from that particular mailing that I sent out. So, good question. I hope that answer helps you out. If you enjoy the Amateur Traveler, one way that you can support the show is to go to podcastawards.com and nominate it for a podcast award. That URL again is podcastawards.com. Vote early, vote often. And with that, we'll wrap up this episode of The Amateur Traveler. Again, remember, if you're interested in sponsoring The Amateur Traveler, drop me a line. You can always contact me at host@amateurtraveler.com, or feel free to leave a comment on this show if you have something that you'd like to say at amateurtraveler.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe.